The morning August Kendrick rode onto Harriet Langley's claim, with an eviction notice folded in his breast pocket. He did not expect to find a woman standing in a half-dug trench with mud up to her knees and fire in her eyes that could have scorched the Kansas plains clean to the Missouri border. It was the spring of 1873, and the Homestead Act had been the law of the land for 11 years, yet men like Cornelius Prout, the cattle baron who employed August and owned most of the county in everything but name, had never once accepted that a piece of paper signed in Washington could give a woman the right to stand between him and the land he wanted. Prout's cattle needed the creek that ran through the northeast corner of what was now, legally and rightfully, Harriet Langley's 160 acres of Kansas grassland. Prout wanted the water rights. He wanted the corridor for his drives. He wanted the land, plain and simple, and he had sent August Kendrick to take it. August was 28 years old, broad across the shoulders, lean at the hip, with a jaw like a stone ledge and dark eyes that had seen enough of the world to be weary of most of it. He had been riding for Prout for 3 years, doing the man's legal errands and occasionally his less-than-legal ones, and he had told himself each time that he was just a hired hand doing a hired hand's job. He had not let himself think too hard about the faces of the people he delivered notices to. He had not let himself think too hard about anything, if the truth were told. He rode up on his sorrel gelding, Copperhead, and reined in at the edge of what would have been the front yard of a homestead that did not yet exist. The sod had been broken in a rough rectangle maybe 30 feet by 20, and inside that rectangle a woman was swinging a pickaxe with both arms like she meant to reach China. She wore a man's canvas work shirt tucked into a dark wool skirt, and her dark auburn hair was pinned up under a sun-bleached straw hat, though several strands had escaped and were plastered against her neck with honest sweat. She was not young in the foolish sense of the word. She looked to be perhaps 25 or 26, old enough to know what she was doing, young enough to still believe she could do it. She did not look up when he stopped. She swung the pickaxe again, drove it into the rocky subsoil, pried up a slab and tossed it aside. "Miss Langley," he said. She swung again. "Miss Langley, I have a notice from Cornelius Prout that requires your—" "I can hear you just fine," she said without stopping. Her voice was clear and dry as creek stone. "I am just choosing not to respond until you say something worth responding to." He sat on his horse for a moment, feeling strangely foolish, which was not a feeling August Kendrick was accustomed to. He pulled the notice from his pocket and held it out even though she was 10 feet away and looking at the ground. "This is a legal document," he said. "It puts you on notice that the land you are currently improving," she said. "Occupying," he continued, though the word felt suddenly insufficient, "is subject to a claim dispute filed by the Prout Cattle Company with the land office in Wichita. You are being formally advised to vacate the premises pending resolution of said dispute." She stopped swinging. She drove the head of the pickaxe into the ground, gripped the handle, and looked up at him for the first time. Her eyes were the color of creek water over pale stone, a gray-green that shifted as the light shifted, and they held in them an expression he recognized as something beyond mere anger. It was the particular fury of a person who has already lost a great deal and refuses, absolutely refuses, to lose one more thing. "Say that word again," she said. He blinked. "Which word?" "Vacate." He opened his mouth and then, for reasons he could not have entirely explained, closed it again. "My husband is buried on the north end of this claim," she said, her voice low and even. "He died of fever last October, 4 months after we filed. My son is 7 years old and he has slept in a canvas tent through a Kansas winter because I spent every cent we had on the filing fee and the seed and the tools. I have been digging this foundation by myself for 6 days. My hands have bled twice." She paused. She tilted her head toward the folded paper in his hand. "Now, you ride back to Cornelius Prout and you tell him that Harriet Langley says to go straight to the devil, and she will be here when he arrives." August Kendrick sat on his horse and said nothing. He looked down at the notice in his hand, and then at the trench she was standing in, and then at the small canvas tent pitched 20 yards away, and beside it the unmistakable small shape of a child crouched in the grass, watching him with wide, dark eyes. Something moved through August's chest that he did not have a good name for. It had the shape of shame and the weight of something older than that. "Dispute," he said more quietly now, "is not frivolous. Pruitt's legal team has found an irregularity in the original survey boundaries that—" "The irregularity," she said flatly, "is that Cornelius Pruitt did not file before I did. That is the only irregularity that exists." She was right. He knew she was right. He had read the file himself, and the land office records were perfectly clear. Harriet Langley had filed her claim on March the 3rd, 1872, 14 months ago. Pruitt had decided he wanted the land in November of that same year, well after the fact, and his lawyers had been manufacturing disputes ever since. August folded the notice slowly. He looked at her standing in that trench, breathing hard from honest work, meeting his eyes without flinching. "The dispute will go to a hearing," he said. "Pruitt has lawyers. He has influence with Judge Calder." "I know what he has," she said. "Then you know that fighting it alone will be difficult." "I did not say I would fight it alone." She reached for her pickaxe again. "I said I would be here. Now, are you going to stand there taking up sky all morning, or are you going to do something useful?" He stared at her. "I beg your pardon." She looked at him with those creek-water eyes. "That trench needs to go another 8 inches before I can start laying the foundation stones. I have a second shovel leaning against that fence post over there. You can either use it or you can leave, but either way, stop blocking my light." The sheer absurdity of it, the sheer unblinking nerve of the woman cracked something open inside August Kendrick that had been sealed shut for longer than he could remember. He looked at the shovel. He looked at her. He looked at the notice in his hand. Then he folded the notice again, tucked it back in his pocket, dismounted, tied Copperhead to the fence post, and picked up the shovel. She watched him climb down into the trench without a word, and if she was surprised, she did not show it. She simply moved to the other end and started swinging her pickaxe again. They worked in silence for a long time. The morning sun climbed and the Kansas wind moved through the tall grass with a sound like a slow river, and August dug and dug and dug, and tried to understand what on earth he thought he was doing. The boy came over eventually. His name was Thomas. Harriet called to him around mid-morning when she stopped to drink from the water jug, and he was 7 years old and small for his age, with his mother's coloring and a serious face that watched August the way wild things watch from the tree line, neither fleeing nor advancing, simply assessing. "Who are you?" Thomas asked. "August," he said. He straightened, drove the shovel into the dirt, and held out a hand. "August Kendrick." Thomas looked at the hand for a moment, then shook it with a grip that was remarkably firm for a 7-year-old. "Did you come to make us leave?" August looked at Harriet, who was at the far end of the trench and either could not hear or was choosing not to intervene. "I came to deliver a message," August said carefully. "Your mother gave me her reply." Thomas considered this. "She does that," he said, with the philosophical resignation of a child who has long since accepted the basic facts of the world he inhabits. He pointed at the trench. "She says the foundation has to go 3 feet down on account of the frost. Do you know about foundations?" "Some," August said. "More than she does, probably not." Thomas nodded, apparently satisfied. "You can borrow my rock hammer if you need it," he said, and went back to whatever he had been doing in the grass. August watched him go, and then he picked up his shovel and went back to digging. At noon, Harriet climbed out of the trench, brushed the worst of the dirt from her skirt, and built a small fire. She had salt pork and cornbread wrapped in cloth, and she heated the pork in a cast iron pan without ceremony, and divided it into 3 portions without being asked, handing August one with no more fuss than if she fed strange men who appeared on her land every day of her life. "Why are you still here?" she asked. She was not unfriendly. She was simply direct in a way that made him realize how rarely he encountered people who said precisely what they meant. "I am not entirely sure," he admitted. She looked at him across the fire. "You work for Prout." "I have been working for Prout," he said carefully, and heard the distinction even as he made it and wondered if he had just said something irrevocable. "There is a difference," she acknowledged. "In your mind, yes. Is there a difference in practice?" He did not answer that immediately, which she seemed to respect more than a quick denial would have earned him. She tore a piece of cornbread and chewed it slowly. "My husband's name was Robert Langley," she said. "He was a good man. A carpenter by trade, in Ohio. We came out here because the land was free for the taking if you were willing to work it. He believed in it the way some men believe in Scripture." She looked out across the grass toward the north end of the claim where, though August could not see it, a grave marker presumably stood. He filed the claim, built the tent, broke the first acre, and then the fever took him in October. The doctor in Hayes said it was a bad strain. It moved fast. She said all of this without tears, with the flat steadiness of someone who has already cried everything there is to cry and arrived at something harder and more durable on the other side of the grief. "I am sorry," August said, and meant it with a depth that surprised him. "I do not need sympathy," she said, not unkindly. "I need 8 more inches of trench and a reliable supply of limestone foundation stones. Do you know where a person can get foundation stones near here?" "There is a limestone outcropping about 2 miles east," he said, because he had ridden this land many times for Prout and knew it well. "The creek cuts through it. You can pry good flat slabs out of the bank." She looked at him differently then, not softly exactly, but with a kind of recalibration, as though she were updating her assessment. "Good," she said. "Then after lunch we will go and get them." "I have a horse," he said, "and a flatbed cart back at." He stopped. The flatbed cart was at the Prout Ranch, which was where he was supposed to return by sundown with signed proof of delivery of the eviction notice. "Back at Prout's," she said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "Could you get it?" He thought about riding back to Prout's spread, looking Cornelius Prout in the eye, telling him he had delivered the notice and the woman had refused, and then asking to borrow the flatbed cart for the afternoon. The image was so impossible it was almost funny. "I could borrow a neighbor's," he said. "Jim Harker has a mule and a sled. He would lend it for the afternoon if I asked." "Do you know Jim Harker?" "I know most people in this county," he said. "I have been riding it for 3 years." She nodded slowly. "All right," she said. "After the trench." They went back to work. The afternoon wore on, hot and bright, the kind of Kansas spring day that reminds you summer is coming and it will not be gentle about it. August worked with the shovel until his shoulders ached in a way that was oddly satisfying, the clean, honest ache of muscles used for something real. He watched Harriet work beside him and was struck repeatedly by the economy of her movements. She did not waste effort, every swing of the pickaxe precisely placed, every load of dirt efficiently cleared. She had learned to do this. She had taught herself, from some combination of necessity and stubbornness, to do something she had never done before, and she was getting good at it. By mid-afternoon the trench was the right depth, and August climbed out and helped Thomas collect the displaced rocks and stack them for later use in the wall. Thomas had opinions about the best way to stack rocks and was not shy about sharing them, and August found himself listening and occasionally agreeing, because the boy was, in point of fact, not wrong about the structural logic of the stacking. "My papa taught me," Thomas said. "He knew about building," August asked. "He was a carpenter. He knew about everything that gets built." Thomas set a stone carefully on the pile. "Mama is learning. She reads his books." August looked across the trench at Harriet, who was measuring something with a piece of knotted rope and frowning in concentration. He found that he could not stop looking at her for very long before he needed to look at her again. He fetched the sled from Jim Harker before sundown, and Harker, a leathery Kansan of 50 who had heard enough about Harriet Langley's situation from the neighbors to have a clear opinion about Prout's tactics, lent it without a single question, along with his mule, named Pearl. They loaded the sled with limestone slabs in the golden late afternoon light, August prying them from the creek bank while Harriet hauled and stacked. working together with an ease that felt uncanny given that they had known each other for approximately 7 hours. On the ride back to the claim, Thomas sat between them on the sled's bench board, and the boy talked about his father building a rocking chair in Ohio, about the way wood smelled when you planed it, about how he wanted to be a carpenter too when he grew up, and whether one could be a carpenter in Kansas or whether it was only a state for cattlemen. August told him that Kansas would need carpenters when the towns grew, and the towns would grow, because people always moved west and then they always stopped moving and started building, and building required men who knew how. Thomas absorbed this information with the same serious quiet that characterized everything he did, and then said, "Are you going to help us build the house?" Harriet said softly. "Thomas." "It is a reasonable question," August said. She looked at him across the boy's head. The evening light was turning the sky pink and orange behind her, and her face in that light was something August was quite certain he would see in his mind for the rest of his life, whether he wanted to or not. "It is," she said quietly, "a reasonable question." He did not answer it that night, because he could not yet answer it honestly, and he had made a private resolution somewhere in the course of that afternoon that he would not say anything to Harriet Langley that was not entirely honest. He returned the mule and sled to Harker, rode back to Pruitt's ranch in the dark, and walked into the ranch house sitting room where Cornelius Pruitt was reading a newspaper beside a fire. Pruitt was 61 years old, heavy-shouldered and pink-faced, with white side whiskers and the satisfied expression of a man who had always gotten what he wanted by leaning hard enough on things. He looked up when August came in. "Well," he said. "She refused the notice," August said. Pruitt folded the newspaper. "Expected as much. These stubborn women always refuse the first notice. We will file the formal challenge next week, and Calder will." "The challenge will not hold," August said. "I have read the land office records myself. She filed first and she has improved the claim. She is digging the foundation of the house as we speak. There is no legal ground." Pruitt's pink face went a shade pinker. "Legal ground can be created," he said with the particular calm of a man who has created it before. "Not this time," August said. "Not from me." The room was very quiet. The fire popped. "Is that so?" Pruitt said. "Yes, sir." Pruitt looked at him for a long moment with eyes that were small and pale and not nearly as dull as they appeared. "You have been a good man to have on my payroll, August. Reliable, smart enough to know when to stop thinking." "Something has changed today." "Yes," August agreed, "something has." He left his wages 2 months' worth on Pruitt's desk. He did not leave his gun, because the gun was his own and he might need it, though he hoped he would not. He took his bedroll and his saddle bags, and he rode Copperhead out of the yard and did not look back, and the stars over Kansas were enormous, and the grass whispered in the dark, and he felt, for the first time in 3 years, as though he was moving towards something instead of away from it. He camped that night beside the creek 2 miles from Harriet's claim. He lay on his back and looked at the stars and thought about the woman swinging a pickaxe in a trench with her hands that had bled and her gray-green eyes that did not ask for help and her boy who wanted to be a carpenter. And he thought, "This is the thing you have been waiting for without knowing you were waiting." He was back at dawn. He tied Copperhead to the fence post and found Harriet crouched at the fire with a coffee pot balanced over the flames, and she looked up at him with no expression of surprise whatsoever, as though she had fully expected him to return and simply been waiting to see whether it would be today or tomorrow. "Coffee," she said. "Please," he said. She poured it into a tin cup and handed it to him, and he crouched beside the fire and drank it and said, "I have left Pruitt's employ." She was quiet for a moment. "Because of me. Because of what I would have had to do to you," he said, "which amounts to the same thing." She turned her coffee cup in both hands. "That will not stop him." "No," he agreed. "It will not. He will file the challenge and send someone else to press it, and Calder is in his pocket, which means the hearing will be difficult." "So what do you suggest?" He set down his cup. "I know the land office process. I know which records he has been misrepresenting, and I can document the actual survey boundaries." And I know a lawyer in Wichita named Ellis Crane who is one of the few men in Kansas that Prout has not been able to purchase. If you will let me help you, I believe we can beat this." She looked at him steadily. "Why would you do this?" It was the honest question he had known was coming, and he answered it honestly. "Because what is being done to you is wrong, because you have already lost enough, and because," he stopped. He looked at the fire. "Because I am tired of being the man who delivers the wrong side of things." She studied him for a long moment. Then she said, "There is a condition. Tell me. You are honest with me, always, about everything. About what Prout is planning, about what our chances are, about everything. I have had enough of men who manage what I know for my own comfort." "Yes," he said immediately. "And you do not make decisions for me. You advise, I decide." "Yes. And you finish the foundation," she said, and the ghost of something that might have been a smile crossed her face. "Because my back is killing me." He laughed. It came out of him before he could stop it, genuine and sudden, and she blinked as though she had not quite expected it. And then the ghost of a smile became a real one, brief and brilliant, and gone almost before he could be certain he had seen it. "All right," he said. "Deal." They shook hands there by the fire as the sun came over the horizon and turned the Kansas grass gold, and the handshake lasted a beat longer than strictly necessary, and both of them noticed, and neither of them mentioned it. The foundation took another 4 days. August proved to know more about construction than he had initially let on. He had spent 2 years as a young man working with a building crew in Missouri before drifting west, and he remembered the principles well enough. He laid out string lines for the corners, checked them with a plumb line borrowed from Jim Harker, and began setting the limestone slabs in the trench with a mortar mix of lime and sand that he taught Thomas to prepare in a wooden box with a hoe. Thomas took to the work with a focused intensity that was both endearing and slightly alarming. The boy did not do things halfway. Harriet watched August work, and occasionally corrected his interpretation of the notes in Robert's carpentry books, which she produced from a canvas satchel, with the careful reverence of someone handling something irreplaceable. They were good books, detailed, clear, written by a man who had understood the principles behind the practice, and not just the practice itself, and August found himself reading them in the evenings by the fire when Harriet put Thomas to bed. She came out one evening and found him reading by the firelight and sat down across from him without saying anything for a while. The night wind was soft, and the stars were doing their vast Kansas business overhead. "He wrote notes in the margins," she said. August looked down at the book, at the small, neat handwriting in the margins of a page about mortise and tenon joints. "I noticed. He planned every detail of the house. On paper, I mean." He had drawings. She reached into the satchel and produced a rolled sheet of paper, unrolled it carefully. It was a floor plan, detailed and precise, drawn in pencil: 2 rooms, a loft, a porch facing east. "I want to build it the way he planned it," she said. Not because I cannot move forward, but because this was what he came here to build, and Thomas should grow up in the house his father designed." August looked at the floor plan for a long time. It was good work. The proportions were right, the details were considered, and there was a note in the margin beside the porch that said, "East-facing for the morning light." Harriet always loved mornings, and August made himself look away from that because something about it landed in his chest with more weight than he could comfortably carry in front of her. "We can build this," he said. "Exactly this." She rolled the paper back up. "What is Prout doing?" "His lawyers filed the formal challenge yesterday," August said. "I sent a letter to Ellis Crane in Wichita this morning from Hayes. Crane will need to see the original survey documents, which are on file at the land office. I am going to ride to Wichita on Thursday." "How long will that take?" 4 days there and back, maybe 5. She nodded. She looked at the fire. "Will Prout do anything while you are gone?" "He might send men to pressure you directly," August said, because he had promised to be honest. "I do not believe he will do anything that would hurt you physically. He is not that kind of man, and he knows what that would cost him publicly. But he might try to intimidate you." She absorbed this. "All right," she said. "Thomas and I have managed intimidation before." "Take this," he said, and reached into his saddlebag and produced a small caliber pistol, a Remington #3 revolver, neatly kept. "I know I have my husband's shotgun," she said, "but thank you." He almost put it away. Then he said, "Take it anyway. The shotgun is for one problem at a time. The pistol is for when there are several." She took it and turned it over in her hands with a competence that told him she was not unfamiliar with firearms. "All right," she said. She looked up at him. "August." He had not heard his name from her before, not directly, and the way she said it, plain and clear, like she had waited and found it acceptable, did something to him he was not prepared to catalog just yet. "Yes," he said. "Thank you for all of this." He looked at her across the fire. "I have not done nearly enough yet," he said, "but I intend to." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she looked back at the fire, and the silence between them was not empty. He rode to Wichita on Thursday morning. He stopped at Jim Harker's first and asked the man to keep an eye on things, which Harker agreed to with the good neighborly solidarity of someone who had been watching Pruitt's operations with increasing distaste for some years. Harker's wife, a capable Scotswoman named Agnes, said she would bring food over every other day and was not open to arguments on the subject. The ride to Wichita was long and hot, and gave August far too much time to think about Harriet Langley, which he did with a thoroughness that left him no illusions about where his feelings were going. He thought about her hands, rough and capable, and still somehow graceful. He thought about the way she had looked at Robert's floor plan, grief and love and determination all knotted together and held without apology. He thought about her laugh, the one full laugh he had managed to pull from her on the second morning, when he had asked Thomas something foolish about whether mules had opinions, and Thomas had said, with great solemnity, that Pearl had many opinions and most of them were about carrots, and how the sound of it had seemed to rearrange something in the basic architecture of who he was. He thought, she is a woman who is carrying grief and a child and a homestead claim, and she is not asking you for rescue. She is asking for competent assistance, and the distinction matters enormously, and you had better not forget it. He thought, I am already lost. Ellis Crane turned out to be a thin, precise man of about 50 who wore steel-rimmed spectacles, and had the manner of someone who had decided that the law was the most interesting thing in the world, and had never seen fit to revise that opinion. He listened to August's account of the situation with great attention, and then went through the survey records and land office documents himself, and his assessment matched August's. Pruitt's challenge had no legal merit. The question was whether Judge Calder would allow legal merit to govern his decision. "Calder has been on Pruitt's side of the table before," Crane said, tapping his pen on his desk. "But there is a federal land commissioner coming through in July, a man named Whitfield, from the General Land Office in Washington. He is doing a review of several disputed claims in the region. If we can get this matter before Whitfield rather than Calder, or even get Whitfield's attention on the record of the proceeding, Calder will be far more careful about whose interests he serves." "Can you arrange that?" August asked. "I can write letters," Crane said. "Several of them. To Whitfield's office, to the land office in Hayes, and to a journalist I know in Topeka who has been looking for a good story about the practices of the large cattle interests. I make no promises, but I have done more with less." They worked for 2 days on the documentation, and August rode back to the claim with a saddlebag full of copies and the cautious sense that the odds had improved from nearly hopeless to merely difficult. He came back to find the foundation finished. Not by Harriet alone. Agnes Harker and her 2 grown sons had come over and spent a day, and Jim Harker had brought his team, and a load of lumber from Hayes that Harriet had apparently ordered 2 weeks ago and somehow already paid for, though August would later discover she had traded her mother's silver brooch to the Hayes merchant for the credit and thought nothing of it. The foundation stones were set, mortared, and cured, and Harriet was standing on top of them with a string line stretched between 2 stakes, doing something with a level that one of Robert's books had evidently explained to her. She looked up when August rode in and said, "You are back." "I am back," he said. He dismounted and looked at the foundation. It was good, better than good, it was right. "You finished it." "The Harker boys helped," she said. "And you set the corners correctly before you left, which made the rest straightforward." Thomas ran from somewhere around the tent and flung himself at August's legs with a force that nearly knocked him sideways, which was startling. And then the boy looked up at him with that serious face and said, "Did you get the lawyer?" "I got the lawyer," August said. Thomas nodded with the gravity of a statesman receiving a favorable treaty. "Good," he said, and went back to whatever he had been doing. August looked at Harriet again. She was watching him with an expression he was beginning to learn, that careful, precise assessment that preceded either acceptance or dismissal, and he held still under it and let her look. "Good trip," she said. "Productive," he said. "I have documents. Ellis Crane is filing letters. There is a federal commissioner due in July who changes the picture considerably." He paused. "I also, on the way back, I stopped in Hayes and spoke to a man named Patterson at the hardware store. He has materials for roof framing. I looked at what the trip cost and compared it to what I have saved," and he stopped because she was looking at him with something cautious in her face. "I am not paying for anything," he said quickly. "That is not what I mean. I want to help with the labor, that is all, the building." She was quiet for a moment. "You are very careful about the distinction," she said. "Yes," he said, "because it matters." She stepped down from the foundation and came to stand a few feet from him, and the Kansas wind moved her loose hair across her face, and she pushed it back with one hand and looked at him very directly. "August," she said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest." "Always," he said. "Why are you doing this? And I do not mean the easy answer, I mean the real one." He held her gaze. He thought about all the careful, sensible things he could say about justice, about the law, about making up for his time on Pruitt's payroll. All of them were true and all of them were insufficient, and she would know the difference. "Because I want to be here," he said. "That is the real answer. I want to be here and I want it to go well for you, and I want—" He stopped, because he was in danger of saying more than she was ready to hear, more than he had earned the right to say. She studied him. The creek water eyes shifted in the light. "All right," she said quietly. "All right." It was not a declaration, but it was not a door closed either. It was something in between, a space she had made deliberately, and August Kendrick had enough sense to walk into it carefully. They began framing the walls the following Monday. August and the two Harker boys worked together under Harriet's direction, and it was genuinely her direction, because she had studied Robert's plans with a thoroughness that put her, by the end of the first week, in full command of every joint and beam placement in the structure. She made decisions with confidence and corrected August twice, once about the spacing of the wall studs and once about the pitch of the roof rafters, and both times she was right and he told her so without qualification. And each time she looked at him with a slight surprise that told him she was still adjusting her expectation of being deferred to. Thomas worked alongside them every day, fetching and carrying and asking questions in a steady, serious stream. He had appointed himself the keeper of his father's carpentry books and would disappear to consult them at intervals, returning to deliver instructions with an air of authority that made Agnes Harker nearly collapse with suppressed laughter on more than one occasion. The walls went up in 2 weeks. They were good walls, solid and plumb, and set true on the limestone foundation that had cost everyone involved so much difficulty. When they stood back and looked at them on a Friday evening, the sun going down behind them and the structure throwing a real shadow across the Kansas grass for the first time, Harriet put her hand flat against the lumber and was quiet for a moment that everyone understood enough to leave her alone in. "He would have loved this," Thomas said. "He would have found 17 things we did wrong," Harriet said, and there was enough truth and tenderness in it that it made everyone smile. That evening, after the Harker boys had gone home, August helped Harriet cook over the campfire. They made a proper stew with dried beans and salt pork that had become something of a daily ritual between them. the preparation of meals being one of the places where they had found an easy, unforced rhythm. Thomas fell asleep in his blankets earlier than usual, worn out from a full day of important consulting work, and August and Harriet sat by the fire in the blue dusk with their coffee and the warm sense of something going right. "Prout sent a man last Tuesday," she said, "while you were in Wichita." August set down his cup. "What did he say?" "He was polite about it," she said. "Very polite. He suggested that Prout was prepared to be generous, that there was a property in Hayes that Prout would purchase for me and Thomas if I were to voluntarily surrender the claim." She turned her cup in her hands. "He said it twice, which told me it was not a genuine offer but a test of my resolve." "What did you say?" The corner of her mouth moved. "I told him I would think about it, and then I walked to the tent and came back with the shotgun and said I had thought about it." August was quiet for a moment, and then he laughed again, the same genuine, surprised sound as the first time, and she smiled at him across the fire, a real smile this time, full and unhurried, and it hit him somewhere between the sternum and the soul. "You are remarkable," he said it so simply and with such unself-conscious sincerity that she seemed to not quite know what to do with it. She looked at the fire. "I am stubborn," she said. "That too," he said. Remarkable and stubborn often look the same from the outside. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Tell me about yourself. You know about my life. I know almost nothing about yours," he told her. He found, honest in a way he had not been with anyone in a long time, not because he had been dishonest before, but because he had spent 3 years keeping himself at a particular distance from things. And sitting by this fire with this woman, he found he could not maintain that distance and did not want to. He told her he was from Virginia originally, that his father had been a schoolteacher and his mother a seamstress, that he had come west after the war, not as a veteran, but as a young man of 19 who had grown up in the shadow of it and needed to go somewhere that had not been shaped by it. He told her about the building work in Missouri and the cattle driving he had done before that, and the 2 years he had spent working honest range work in Colorado before Prout had hired him with a salary that seemed good at the time and a job description that had turned out to mean something different in practice than in contract. "Did you know what it would mean?" she asked. "When you took the job?" "Not entirely," he said. "And then I knew, and I told myself it was legal work, which some of it was, and that I could be useful to people by being on the inside of it, which was partly true and partly convenient." "And then you came to my claim," she said. "And then I came to your claim," he agreed. He looked at her. "And you handed me a shovel." She met his eyes, and this time neither of them looked away for a long moment, and the fire crackled between them and the stars were immense and the walls of her house stood dark against the sky, and August thought, "I will remember this exact moment for the rest of my life." "August," she said very quietly. "Yes." "I am not," she stopped. "Robert has been gone 8 months," she said carefully. "I am not, I do not know yet what I am capable of, in terms of," she looked for the word. "I know," he said. And he did know, and more importantly, he meant it. He was not offering a comfort or a deflection. He was stating an honest fact. He was content to be where he was. He had nowhere else he wanted to be. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For understanding that." She looked at the fire. "Robert would have liked you," she said after a moment. "He was a good judge of character, and he liked men who were honest about the complicated parts." August thought about the carpentry books with their careful marginal notes. "He sounds like someone worth knowing," he said. "He was," she said. She stood, brushing her skirt. "I am going to sleep. You should too. The roof boards start tomorrow." "Good night, Harriet." She paused at the tent flap and looked back at him. "Good night, August." He slept under the open sky beside the fire and listened to the grass, and thought that the word good had never sounded so precisely accurate. The roof went on in the 3rd week, and it was the hardest work of all, the awkward geometry of ridge boards and rafters in the heat of late May, a Kansas sky so blue it hurt the eyes, a wind that grabbed at planks and tried to fling them sideways. August worked without his shirt for 2 days because the heat left no other option, and on the second afternoon He caught Harriet looking at the scar along his left ribs from a knife fight in Pueblo 4 years ago that he was not proud of, and he explained it matter-of-factly, and she listened and said, "I am glad you were not more seriously injured," in a tone that was careful and sincere, and told him she had noticed she had been looking and had decided that was allowable information. He was, he knew, falling entirely and irreversibly in love with her. He had accepted this and was not fighting it. He was simply being as useful and as honest as he knew how to be, and he was letting things move at whatever pace was right for her and for the situation, because he understood that love of the durable kind is not something you can hurry. Ellis Crane wrote in early June with good news. The federal land commissioner, Whitfield, had been informed of the Langley-Prute dispute and had added it to his July review agenda. Calder, apparently made nervous by the prospect of federal scrutiny, had postponed the formal challenge hearing until September, which effectively gave Harriet the summer to continue improving the claim. Every day of improvement made her position stronger. When August read Crane's letter to Harriet over the breakfast fire, she closed her eyes for a moment and pressed her lips together hard, and he thought she was about to cry. And then she opened her eyes and they were perfectly dry, and she said, "Right. Then we have all summer. I want the interior walls done before July." He laughed. "Good morning to you too," he said. "I am being practical," she said, but the corner of her mouth was doing that thing he loved. The interior walls went up. The window frames went in, glazed with real glass that Harriet had budgeted for with the same meticulous attention she gave everything, counting every cent without apparent distress or self-pity, simply treating money as a practical reality to be managed. A fireplace and chimney were built by Jim Harker, who turned out to have laid a number of chimneys in his life and could not be talked out of contributing the work, and the resulting structure was square and drew beautifully, and gave the main room a presence that made it feel, for the first time, like a house and not a construction site. Thomas was given his choice of the loft or the small second room for his bedroom, and chose the second room after a consultation with one of his father's books that he refused to explain, and then spent a weekend arranging his few possessions with architectural seriousness. On a Saturday in the middle of June, after a long day of plastering the interior walls with a lime mixture that left everyone's hands white and their arms aching, Harriet went to the creek to wash up, and August walked down to the water a little later without thinking about whether she was still there, and found her sitting on a limestone slab with her bare feet in the current and her hair down for the first time since he had known her, all of it, the full dark auburn weight of it, loose around her shoulders and catching the evening light in a way that made him stop walking. She looked up at him. He said, "I apologize. I did not know." "Sit down," she said. "The water is cold." "It is magnificent." He sat on the bank and took off his boots and rolled his trousers and put his feet in the water, which was indeed shockingly cold and immediately improved everything. They sat for a while without talking. A kingfisher went through downstream in a bolt of blue and rust. The current talked quietly over the stones. "I want to say something," Harriet said. "Go ahead." She kept looking at the water. "I noticed that you are—" She stopped and began again. "I have been— There is something that I am—" She stopped again, which was unusual for her, because she was normally a person who found words without difficulty. "I noticed that you are a very good man," she said finally, which was clearly not exactly what she had set out to say but seemed to be the honest center of it. "I am trying to be," he said. "I know," she said. "That is the part I notice, that you are trying, and not for performance but because you—" She turned her head and looked at him directly and her hair moved across her shoulder. "Because you actually want to be." He held her gaze. His heart was doing something complicated. "Harriet," he said. "Yes. I am going to say something and then I am going to let it sit and not press it in any direction." She waited. "I am very much in love with you," he said. "I have been aware of it for some time and I see no reason to pretend otherwise. I am not asking for anything. I am just—" He looked at the creek, being honest, "because that is what I said I would be." The Kingfisher went through again, back upstream this time, the same improbable bolt of color. The water ran over the stones. Harriet was quiet for long enough that he began to think perhaps he had misjudged the moment, and then she said, quietly and clearly, "I am aware of something on my end as well. That is all I am able to say honestly right now, but I wanted you to know it." He looked at her. She was looking at the water. "That is enough," he said, "more than enough." And it was. They sat by the creek until the light was gone and talked about other things, about the second acre. She wanted to break for planting in the fall, about Thomas's progress with the carpentry book, about Crane's legal strategy, about whether the winter wheat had held in Harker's west field. And the evening was the best evening August could remember in years. July came in with a heat like a held breath. Commissioner Whitfield arrived in Hayes on the 12th of July and spent 3 days reviewing disputed claims in the region. And Ellis Crane had done his work superbly. Whitfield's office had a complete record of the Prout-Langley matter, including documentation of Prout's delayed filing, the original survey boundaries, and an account of Prout's prior use of legal pressure to remove homesteaders from adjacent claims, 2 of which had settled under duress, and 1 of which had since been successfully challenged and overturned. August and Harriet rode to Hayes together for the hearing, leaving Thomas with Agnes Harker, and sat before Whitfield in the county offices with Ellis Crane beside them. Prout was there with 2 lawyers in Eastern suits, and Calder was present as a recording witness, not a judge. Whitfield had made it clear that the review was a federal proceeding, and Calder's role was precisely that limited one. Whitfield was a quiet man with thinning hair and reading glasses, and an air of absolute, unimpressed authority. He asked Harriet several questions directly, listening to her answers with the same careful attention he gave the legal documents, and August watched her respond precise, clear, utterly unintimidated, and felt a pride in her that he had no technical right to feel and felt anyway. Prout's lawyers argued the survey irregularity claim. Crane demolished it with the original survey records. They argued continuous use of the land by Prout's cattle. Crane pointed out that continuous use by cattle does not constitute a homestead claim, and that the law was quite clear on this distinction, and that the federal commissioner might wish to note that this argument had been made to remove 2 other homesteaders from adjacent claims in the previous 2 years, 1 of which had been wrongly vacated as a result. Prout, who had remained silent through most of it with his hands folded on the table and his pink face carefully neutral, spoke up once at the end. He said that he had no wish to be unreasonable, that he had always respected the law, and that he believed this could be settled amicably. Whitfield looked at him over his reading glasses and said, "The law has already settled it, Mr. Prout. Miss Langley filed first, has complied with improvement requirements, and has a fully documented claim. My recommendation to the Land Office will reflect that clearly. I would advise you to redirect your legal resources." They rode home in the afternoon sun, and Harriet held herself straight and composed the entire way, and when they came over the last rise and saw the house, the real house, with its white-plastered walls and its east-facing porch and its chimney standing solid against the sky, she pulled her horse to a stop and just looked at it. August stopped beside her. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "We built that." "You built that," he said. "We helped." She looked at him. Her eyes were bright. "We," she said firmly. "All of us. That is a we." He looked back at the house and the grass and the claim that was now, permanently and completely, hers, and the words sat warm in his chest like the first fire of winter. The celebration that evening was modest by any outside standard and enormous by the standards of everyone present. Agnes Harker brought a ham and a dried apple pie. Jim Harker brought a bottle of genuine whiskey that he had been saving for a good occasion. The Harker boys came and ate with great enthusiasm. And Thomas, informed that the house was truly and finally theirs and no one was going to take it, absorbed the news for about 30 seconds and then said, "I knew that," and went back to the ham. August sat on the east porch steps in the dark after the Harkers had gone, and Harriet came and sat beside him, and they were close enough that her shoulder was against his arm and neither of them moved away. "What will you do now?" she asked. "Your part of it is finished." He felt the question land and understood its weight and answered it carefully. "I have no intention of going anywhere," he said, "unless you want me to." She was quiet for a moment. "There is a lot of work to do," she said. "The second acre, the kitchen garden, the barn, eventually." "I know. I cannot pay you," she said. "I know that too." She turned her head and looked at him in the dark, and her face was very close. "August, what are you saying?" He held her gaze. "I am saying that this is the place I want to be. That you and Thomas are that He stopped. He had promised honesty, and he owed her the full honest thing, not a careful edge of it. "I want to be here," he said. "Not as a hired hand and not as a charity case and not as anything complicated. Just here, if there is a place for that." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned her face away and looked out at the dark grass and the stars, and when she spoke her voice was very quiet. "My son talks about you every morning," she said. "He woke up last week and his first sentence was something about whether you knew how to cut a dovetail joint. I have never heard him ask about anyone like that." "I did not know that," August said. "I know you did not." She paused. "I talk about you too in my head, constantly." She turned to look at him again. "I did not plan this. I want you to understand that. I came to Kansas to build what my husband and I had planned. I was not looking for, I did not expect, I know," he said gently. "Neither did I, but here you are," she said, almost wonderingly. "Here I am," he said. She looked at his face in the dark for a long, serious moment, and then she leaned forward and kissed him, and it was simple and careful and deliberate, the way she did everything. And then she pulled back and looked at him again as though checking that she had read it right. He put his hand against her face gently. "Harriet," he said. "Yes," she said, as though that were an answer to something. And then she kissed him again, and this time it was not careful, and the Kansas stars looked on without comment. The summer moved with the particular golden weight of a season that matters. August stayed. There had never been any real question of it, and the work continued. The second acre broken with a rented plow and Jim Harker's team. The kitchen garden planted in neat rows that Thomas maintained with a dedication that would have been compulsive in a lesser spirit, but in him read simply as thoroughness. A small lean-to went up behind the house for storing tools and eventually, they hoped, for a horse of their own. August and Harriet moved through those weeks in the particular way of two people who have said the important things and are now learning each other in the dailiness of living. The small habits and preferences and minor irritations. The way he liked his coffee black and scalding, and she liked hers with a little sugar that she rationed carefully. The way she hummed to herself, while she worked and stopped the moment she realized she was doing it, and he had learned not to mention it because she stopped if he did. The way he fell asleep instantly and woke at the smallest sound. The way she lay awake reading by candlelight until she was too tired to hold the book. He was sleeping in the lean-to, which was clean and private and suited him, and this was the proper arrangement and both of them knew it, and neither of them was in any particular hurry to change it because what they had was good and they were not careless people. Thomas asked in August, sitting at the supper table with the directness that characterized all his most important inquiries, "Are you going to marry my mother?" The silence that followed lasted approximately 2 full seconds, and then Harriet said, "Thomas." "It is a reasonable question," Thomas said, using August's own phrase back at him with perfect accuracy. August looked at Harriet across the table, and she was looking at her plate, but her mouth was doing the thing, the corner-of-mouth thing that he loved. "That," August said, "is something your mother and I would discuss before we discussed it with anyone else." Thomas considered this for a moment and then said, "All right," and went back to eating, satisfied, apparently, that the question had been entered into the official record. That evening after Thomas was in bed, Harriet came out to the porch and sat in the chair she had been using increasingly often, one of two that August had made over several evenings from lumber scraps, working from one of Robert's carpentry books in what he had privately thought of as an act of both respect and love. "He is not subtle," she said. "He is very direct," August agreed. He was sitting on the porch steps, leaning against the post. "He gets it from someone." She was quiet for a moment. "He is right to ask," she said. "It is on my mind as well. I want to be honest about that." He looked at her. The evening was soft and warm, moths moving in the yellow light from the window. "Is it something you want?" he asked. "Not something you think is practical or something you think I want, something you want." She turned her head and looked at him with the full weight of those gray-green eyes. "Yes," she said, "it is something I want when I am ready. When it is," she exhaled. "When it is right and not rushed and done for the right reasons, but yes." He felt something settle in him, quiet and certain, like the last foundation stone dropped into place. "Good," he said. "Good," she agreed. They sat on the porch until the stars were out in force, and he reached up and took her hand where it rested on the arm of the chair, and she turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his, and that was how it was. Autumn came in September with Calder's postponed hearing, which was now something of a formality given Whitfield's recommendation, but they attended it with Crane nonetheless, and Calder, with the careful look of a man who has counted his friendships and found several of them diminished, ruled in Harriet's favor, dismissed Pruett's challenge, and confirmed the claim in full. Pruitt was in the courtroom and said nothing, and August watched his face and saw in it the resigned calculation of a man who has lost one battle and is already looking at the next map, and he made a mental note to keep watching. But Pruitt did not make another move on the Langley claim. Perhaps Whitfield's report had made the cost too obvious. Perhaps there were other homesteaders to pressure, other corridors to secure. Whatever the reason, the matter was closed, and August chose to trust the closure and stop watching the horizon for it. The winter was hard, as Kansas winters were, and the house proved itself, the foundation solid under frost heave, the chimney drawing true, the walls keeping the wind out with the honest stubbornness of well-built things. Thomas slept in his room with his father's books and woke every morning to help with the chores with an enthusiasm that was, by now, somewhat less about being helpful and somewhat more about what he had decided was his personal responsibility for the operation of the farm. Christmas was quiet and warm. Agnes Harker came over with mince pies. Jim brought tobacco that he and August smoked on the porch in the cold while the women talked inside, and Thomas explained the structural principles of a wooden fort he intended to build in the spring to anyone who would listen. In January, on a Sunday afternoon when the snow was down and the world was white and still, and Thomas was in his room with a puzzle, August found Harriet at the table writing in a small journal she kept, and she looked up at him, and something in her face was different. "Sit down," she said. He sat. "I want to get married in the spring," she said. "When the grass comes back, on the east porch because Robert designed it for morning light." She looked at him steadily. "If you are still, yes," he said before she finished the sentence. She looked at him. "You did not let me finish." "There is no version of the end of that sentence that changes my answer," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer, and then something released in her face, not an abandonment of the composure she carried like armor, but a softening of it, a deliberate lowering of something she had been holding up for a long time, and she looked in that moment very young and very certain and very beautiful. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. He took both her hands across the table. Spring came back to Kansas with the slow inevitability of all the best things. The grass returned, green gold and moving, and the creek ran high with snowmelt, and the kitchen garden was replanted with Thomas in charge of the bean rows, which he took extremely seriously. The linta was extended into a proper small barn, for the mare August had bought in February, a sturdy chestnut named Clara, who Thomas immediately annexed as a personal project. They were married on the east porch on the 14th of April, 1874, with Jim and Agnes Harker as witnesses and Thomas standing beside August in his good shirt with an expression of profound satisfaction. The local minister, a practical man named Reverend Howell from Hayes, who had made the trip out willingly and asked no unnecessary questions, performed the ceremony in the morning light that fell exactly as Robert Langley had drawn it on his floor plan, exactly as he had intended it, for Harriet, who always loved mornings. August and Harriet stood in that light and said what needed to be said, simply and without performance, looking at each other with the particular honesty that had been the beginning of everything between them. And when the minister said, "You may kiss your bride," August cupped her face in both hands and kissed her with a tenderness that made Agnes Harker produce a handkerchief and Jim Harker find something interesting to look at in the middle distance. Thomas shook August's hand afterward with great solemnity and said, "I suppose you can call me Tom if you want." Papa did, and August said, "Thank you, Tom," and the boy nodded as though a decision had been finalized and went to check on Clara. The year that followed was the best August had ever known. He had not thought of himself as someone who needed belonging. He had told himself for years that he was suited to the road, to movement, to the in-between places that didn't require you to put your name on anything. He understood now that he had been wrong, not about his past but about his future, and that the difference between drifting and choosing was so profound. It made his previous life feel like a language he had been speaking without knowing what the words meant. He and Harriet worked the farm together with the easy competence of two people who respect each other's judgment, argue sometimes and briefly and honestly, and make decisions by the practical and mutually satisfying method of talking until they agree. He taught her things he knew, and she taught him things she knew, and Tom taught them both things he found in his father's books that neither of them had thought to learn. And the farm grew and the garden grew, and in the fall of their first year of marriage, they broke 2 more acres for wheat. Tom turned 9 that autumn and had become, in August's considered opinion, one of the more remarkable children he had ever encountered, serious and curious and funny in the dry, understated way of someone who has been around adults enough to understand that most things are funnier than they appear. August helped him begin a real carpentry project that winter, a small chest for his room, made from pine boards, with dovetail joints worked from his father's book. They spent 2 months on it, evenings in the barn by lamplight while the cold pressed against the walls, and when the chest was finished, it was genuinely good, a 9-year-old's work, but honest and true. And Tom put his father's books in it and closed the lid with the satisfaction of a craftsman who has made something worthy of the things it holds. In November of 1875, Harriet told August she was expecting. He was splitting wood in the yard, and she came out and said it matter-of-factly, because she did not do things otherwise, and he set the axe down and took her face in his hands and looked at her with an expression he was entirely unable to regulate. "August," she said, amused. "I know," he said. "I know, give me a moment." She gave him the moment. He used it to look at her, this woman who had handed him a shovel in a muddy trench and changed the entire direction of his life, and feel the full weight and the full gift of being exactly where he was. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Are you?" "I am completely well," she said. "I want to keep working as long as I can, and Agnes has offered to come when the time is close, and I have already written to the doctor in Hayes." "Of course you have," he said. "I am practical," she said. "The most practical woman on the Kansas plains," he agreed and kissed her, and she returned it with a warmth that was more than warmth. Tom took the news with his customary solemnity. He said, "I read that it is important to avoid startling the mother." He thought for a moment. "I will try to be quieter." "You are not loud," Harriet said. "I could be louder," Tom said, with a completely straight face, and August laughed until his eyes watered. The baby came in June of 1876, on a hot, bright morning when the creek was low and the meadowlarks were doing their business in the grass. Agnes Harker attended along with the doctor from Hayes, and August paced the east porch in the early hours in a state of controlled terror that he managed by making himself useful in small ways, keeping water hot, keeping Tom calm, making coffee that nobody drank. The baby was a boy. He was red and loud and had no hair to speak of, and was, in August's immediate and unshakable opinion, the finest thing he had ever seen. They named him James Robert Kendrick. James for Jim Harker, who had been as steady a neighbor as a man could ask for. Robert for the man who had planted this claim and designed this house, and whose carpentry books lived in his older son's chest in the room across the hall. Tom took the matter of being a brother with the same considered seriousness he applied to everything. He asked to hold James on the second day, sat very still with the baby in his arms and his arms held very carefully, and said, looking down at the small red face, "He looks like you, I think," directed at August. "Poor boy," August said. Harriet laughed from the bed, the best, most luminous laugh he had heard from her yet. The farm continued to grow in the years that followed, acre by acre and season by season, the way things grow when they are properly tended. The wheat held through 2 good harvests and 1 difficult one, and in the difficult one they made do without complaining because the people on that claim had a long acquaintance with making do. August built a proper barn in the summer of 1877, a real one this time, with a hay loft and stalls for 3 animals, and Tom, 11 now and genuinely skilled with tools, worked as a real partner on it, not a helper, and the results showed both facts. Harriet began a kitchen garden that expanded each year until it was producing enough to sell the surplus in hays, and she kept the accounts herself with the same meticulous precision she brought to everything, and the account books showed, steadily and without drama, that the Langley Kendrick claim was not merely surviving but prospering. They sat on the east porch in the evenings as much as the weather allowed, the 4 of them increasingly, James on Harriet's lap or crawling across the boards with the single-minded determination of a person with many places to be, Tom with whatever book he was currently dissecting, August with the comfortable quietness of a man who has found the exact place he belongs. In the evenings when James was asleep and Tom was in his room, and the dark had settled fully over the grass, August and Harriet sat in the 2 chairs he had built from scraps in the very first summer, still solid, those chairs, still true, and talked or were quiet together with the ease of people who have moved well past the need to fill every silence. She would sometimes take out Robert's floor plan, the original, carefully preserved in the satchel, and unfold it on her knee and look at it, and August would look with her, and they would find what they had built in it and what had changed from the original and what had stayed exactly right. "He was a good planner," August said once. "He was," she agreed, "and a good man, and I think he would—" She stopped, folded the paper carefully. "I think he would be glad of this," she said, "of all of it." August reached over and took her hand. "I am glad of it," he said. She turned her head and looked at him with the gray-green eyes that had never once stopped moving him, and the east-facing porch caught the last of the light and she was in it, just as Robert had designed, and the house was solid behind them and the claim was theirs and the children were safe inside. "August Kendrick," she said, the way she always said his full name when she meant the most. "So am I." The meadowlarks went through the grass, and the creek ran over its stones, and the stars came up one by one over the Kansas plain, and somewhere in the house a small boy made a sound in his sleep, and an older boy turned a page, and on the east porch 2 people held hands in the dark with the quiet, unshakable contentment of those who have built something true and know it. The spring of 1879 brought a warm season and a new project. Tom, 13 now and no longer fitting the description of a boy in any practical sense, had decided the time had come to build his workshop. He had presented the proposal to August and Harriet with a hand-drawn floor plan that showed his father's influence in every careful line, and he had argued his case calmly and thoroughly, and acknowledged every concern they raised before offering his response to it. And the result was that ground was broken for the workshop in April, and August worked alongside him with the same partnership they had brought to the barn. And this time it was August who deferred on the structural questions, because Tom had by now surpassed him, and they both knew it. James, nearly 3, followed them everywhere on thick, unsteady legs, providing commentary in a language only he fully understood, and occasionally handing people the wrong tool with great confidence. August picked him up from the dirt an average of 4 times per afternoon, and the boy took each rescue as a brief interruption, and immediately returned to whatever had caused it. Harriet watched them from the kitchen garden sometimes, and felt something she did not have a single word for, but that contained within it all the component parts of a life she had once thought was over, and had turned out to be, in the most important ways, just beginning. She thought about the morning August Kendrick had ridden onto her claim with a piece of paper in his pocket, and found her standing in a trench with mud on her skirt and a pickaxe in her hands, and she thought about handing him a shovel, and she thought, I did not know, that morning, what I was doing. She knew now. She had been handing him the thing that would root him. She had been giving him a reason to stay when the reasons he had been carrying were all reasons to leave. He came across the yard on a June evening with James on his hip and wood shavings in his hair from an afternoon in the workshop, and he said, Tom wants to know if we can expand the chicken enclosure this weekend. And she said, Yes, we can, and he said, Also James ate some dirt again, and she said, He always does. And they stood in the garden with the warm wind moving through the bean rows, and the house solid behind them, and the workshop taking shape beyond the barn and the claim stretching out in every direction. All 160 acres of it. All theirs, all earned, all built with their own hands from the ground up. August set James down, and the boy immediately made for the nearest interesting piece of dirt with the focus of a small, determined person who has many important things to examine. August stood beside Harriet and looked at the farm they had made. What are you thinking? She asked. That I came to this place to deliver a message, he said, and got an entirely different one than I brought. She looked up at him. What message did you get? He looked at her. This woman who had changed his direction the way the creek changed the direction of the plain, not by force, but by being simply, completely, unmovably there, exactly as herself, refusing to be anything other than what she was. That some things are worth digging for, he said. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she leaned against his arm, and he put his arm around her, and they stood in the evening light, while their son investigated the ground, and their older son built something in the workshop with the quiet precision of his father's hands working through his. And the meadowlark sang in the tall grass, and the east-facing porch waited for them in the last of the light. And the Kansas plain held it all, the grave on the north end of the claim, the limestone foundation. The house built from a dead man's plans, by the woman who had loved him, and the man who had come to take it all away, and found instead that he had come home.